When it comes to the Second World War, we've all heard of the major players, the Germans and the Italians in Europe, the British fighting across North Africa, and that time during Pearl Harbor when a Japanese pilot crash-landed on a Hawaiian island, teamed up with some locals but was then driven off by a man and his wife using only a knife, forestalling a Japanese invasion. But to more interesting things, what about some of those smaller countries that we don't normally hear about when it comes to the Second World War? In this series, I'd like to explore their stories, and in this episode, I'd like to look at Ireland, because Ireland is one of those countries whose Second World War experience was completely different to the experience the nation had during the First World War, largely because at the time of the First World War, Ireland was still a part of the British Empire, and so it sent soldiers to the front to fight alongside others from Britain and further abroad. However, during the war in 1916, with growing resentment at British rule in Ireland at home, there was a series of rebellions throughout the country, most famously in Dublin, aimed at removing the British presence in Ireland completely. While this Easter Rising actually failed in the end, resentment continued, and the Eire, the Irish Republican Army, was formed and went from strength to strength in the following years. If you'd like to find out more, I've got a 5-minute history introduction on this topic that you can view. Now, in 1919, a full-scale war broke out called the Irish War of Independence, and by 1921 the British realised that a military victory was probably not going to be around the corner, and so they decided to sign a peace treaty with the Irish. This Anglo-Irish treaty would create a free state, a British dominion in the south that was ruling itself independently, whilst the northern 6 counties would remain as part of the United Kingdom. The IRA was split about whether to accept this deal or not. Those who did want to accept the peace deal, fearing they couldn't otherwise defeat the British, were called the pro-treaty IRA, whilst those who opposed it were called the anti-treaty IRA, and the two fought one another in what became known as the Irish Civil War. After a year of brutal fighting, the pro-treaty side won the war, and they became the Irish Free State, a recognised state in the south of the island of Ireland. The pro-treaty IRA would also continue and create a political party called the Fine Gael. Meanwhile, the anti-treaty IRA, some of them laying down their arms, also went into politics and created the political party Fianna Fáil. Others, however, continued to fight against both the Irish Free State and the British in Northern Ireland for a united Irish state. Now, in 1932, things were upset because Fianna Fáil, the political party of the defeated anti-treaty IRA, came to power themselves in the Free State. In 1937, a new constitution was drafted and the country officially changed its name from the Free State to Ireland, or also the Irish Eire, which just means Ireland. And by 1938 they were also further distancing themselves from the United Kingdom, and for much of the 1930s they had been engaged in a so-called trade war with the British. Part of the resolution of this trade war was that the 3 deep water ports, known as treaty ports, found throughout the new Irish Free State were to be returned to the Irish, because in 1921, when they had been given over to the Free State, these 3 ports remained in British hands so that the British Navy could use them if in case another war broke out. These were vital stations to counter U-boat attacks as they had been in the First World War. But now in 1938 they were returned to the new country Ireland. While this has been a bit of a whistle-stop tour of earlier 20th century Irish history, if you're interested in looking a bit more in-depth, especially at the Easter Rising, then check out today's video sponsor, which is Magellan TV. In particular, there's a really good documentary called 7 Women, which follows the stories of 7 women during that fateful week in 1916 in Dublin during the Easter Rising. Not only does it look at the experiences of some of the women who fought alongside the men against the British, but it also looks at those who were against the Rising, because quite a few people in Ireland at the time were not in favour of Ireland becoming an independent state and didn't like the violence that was being carried out in the country. Now, the reason this is important for this video is that, as we'll see with the outbreak of the Second World War, which wasn't that long after this, many people were unsure how to feel or who to side with, and a lot of people in Ireland reacted in different ways. Now, if you go to the description below or simply type try.magellantv.com/historywithhilbert, then you'll get access to this great documentary as well as many others on history, including some more on Irish history as well. So when war breaks out in 1939, Ireland is technically a British dominion, but unlike in the First World War when its stature was significantly different, it was not obliged to send its men to the front line with the British Army, and the British Army wasn't allowed to tell the Irish government what they had to be doing either, which is a big difference to the First World War. Now, on the 1st of September 1939, this of course being the date that German troops crossed into Poland, thus kickstarting the war in Europe, the Irish government said in an emergency meeting, the government may, whenever and so often as they think fit, make by order such provisions as are, in the opinion of the government, necessary or expedient for securing the public safety, or the preservation of the state, or for the maintenance of public order, or the provision and control of supplies and services to the life of the community. Basically, they were declaring a state of emergency. And it's just this word, emergency, which is what the situation was called in Ireland during the entire war. And in Ireland, they didn't speak about the war that was going on in Europe, they called it the emergency, which says something about their perspective on the situation. Despite no longer being required to do so, part of the provisions of the Anglo-Irish Treaty meant that those in Ireland who wished to serve with the British Armed Forces were allowed to do so, and some 50,000 men and women volunteered to fight alongside the British in the army, the navy, as well as in the merchant navy. There were even some 5,000 who were already a member of the Irish army themselves, although this was illegal for them to do because they were conscripted in another armed service. And so when they returned home after having been in the British army, they were often discriminated against and lost their pensions and were removed from the armed services, something which the Irish government only apologised for in 2013. Many people in Ireland, however, saw the British as the old oppressors and remembered it had only been some 30 years since they were actively fighting against them, and so this isn't too hard to imagine. And many Irish people therefore felt that the right place was to remain neutral and outside of British affairs, some even actively supporting the other side that was fighting against the British in Ireland. Indeed, there were some fascist movements in Ireland at the time, although how major a part of the population this was probably wasn't particularly significant. Some, like the Blue Shirts, are often called quasi-fascist, while the real hardcore nationalist socialist movements never attracted many members. However, it should be remembered that during the Spanish Civil War, which I talked about in my videos on the nationalists and the Republicans, there was an international brigade from Ireland that fought both for the nationalist side, these were the Blue Shirts, led by Eoin O'Duffy, who was himself a fascist, and there was one fighting for the Republicans against the fascists in Spain. The IRA would be much more of a difficult question when it came to supporting the Germans, because the IRA at the outbreak of the war were engaging in S-Plan, short for Sabotage Plan, which was an increase of manoeuvres along the Irish border. At the beginning of the war, they even broke into an Irish army barracks and took many weapons for themselves. Their ultimate goal was the unification of the island of Ireland, often by any means necessary. And in fact, their leader even went over to discuss in 1940 with German High Command in Berlin. He received arms and ordnance training from the Germans, but he was killed when the submarine he was in was sunk on the way back to Ireland, and so the plan never materialized. In the end, the German High Command decided that working together with the IRA as a potential third column for a German invasion of Ireland and then Britain would be more of a liability and so wouldn't be successful, and the Germans therefore decided to scrap working with the IRA against their other enemies. There was a very real possibility of the unification of Ireland in 1940, but not in the way that the IRA or anyone else might have expected. This was because the British were in full retreat in the summer of 1940 after the Battle of France was going completely wrong for the Allies. And high up in the British government, a secret proposal was made to the government in Ireland, being led by Eamon de Valera, that said that they would reunite Ireland if the Irish promised to immediately enter the war and declare the war against Germany and Italy, although Eamon de Valera, which must have been a difficult choice, decided to decline as he wanted to respect Irish neutrality in the war so far. This must have been an excruciating decision for de Valera, who had been a commander during the 1916 Dublin Uprising, who had fought in the War of Independence and later was even an anti-treaty leader during the Civil War and had finally come to power in Ireland on the basis of trying to restore unification of the island of Ireland, but he turned this down for the sake of Irish neutrality. This was only made public in 1970 when he released his biography, and this was kept very much secret from the Irish public at the time. Now, Ireland during the war was invested in keeping itself neutral and secure, and so it had to contend with the possibility of invasion from both the Germans and the British. And after the war, it was revealed that both the Germans and the British had drawn up plans for a potential future invasion of the island. Fearing these potential invasions from both the Germans and the British, the Irish army greatly increased in size to around 100,000 reserves and 40,000 regulars. Of the two, it was probably more likely that the British would end up invading Ireland, possibly to force them to join the war effort or to retake control of those deep water ports that were so important in fighting back against the U-boats, as well as to allow Irish ports to be homes and safe havens for convoys and shipping coming across the Atlantic that were bringing the much needed food reserves and rations into the beleaguered United Kingdom. None wanted this more so than Lord Craigavon, the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, a staunch Ulster Unionist who called Eamon de Valera a Nazi sympathiser and wanted Scottish and Welsh troops to overrun the south of Ireland and appoint him as the Governor-General of the entire thing. Thankfully, no one in London took him seriously. Or did they? There is actually notice that Winston Churchill asked Bernard Montgomery to create a plan for a potential takeover of the Irish ports at Cork and also the close-by harbour of Cobh, although these plans never came into action. The idea of the British taking over a neutral country in the Second World War isn't that rare, to be honest. If you look at my video on the Brits in Iceland, they took over a neutral country and they did the same thing in the Faroe Islands. So the idea of the British coming into Ireland if it suited their interest, even if they painted that simply as keeping the Germans out, isn't as far-fetched as it might today have sounded. However, there was also quite a bit of dialogue between the government of Ireland and the government of the United Kingdom, as in 1940, when country after country was falling to the German advance, there was a plan that was drawn up that would allow British soldiers to enter Ireland in the case of an invasion, because of course this would greatly threaten Britain as well. This was labelled Plan W, and it would allow for British troops to enter neutral Irish soil if the Germans did indeed invade and fight alongside the Irish army. The Irish also, The Irish also allowed the British and Allied aircraft to fly over a stretch of airspace that was Irish airspace over Donegal, called the Donegal Corridor, to allow them to reach the open sea, which also greatly aided their efforts there. And in fact, the meteorological reports that made it possible for D-Day to occur on a day without too much storms, this also came from Ireland and was of course of great importance to the Allied victory in the end. So there was quite a bit of dialogue between them. The Irish were ever the pragmatists, however, and they also negotiated to a certain extent with the Germans. Now, as I said, this may seem very shocking today, but this must be seen in the backdrop of the Irish struggle against the British. And part of the reason why de Valera didn't accept the entrance into the war, he later revealed, was because he thought that if the Irish were to enter the war, then many of the people in Ireland who had been pro-treaty, this was quite a significant minority, might well rise up and become completely pro-German because they were so against working with the British. He also met several times with the German consul in Ireland, Edward Hempel, who conveyed back to Berlin that he required the Germans not to do any actions that may result in the British invading Ireland, and this is something that the Germans were quite conscious of in their treatment towards the Irish. He also was stated in 1945, and this is something that the Irish government has very much been criticised for their role in the Second World War, is that after Hitler had killed himself, he actually signed the condolence card for Adolf Hitler, the only Western democracy to have done so. There was further scandal because after the end of the war, and in fact during the war, when there were Jewish refugees applying to come to Ireland, escaping the Germans, they were very frequently turned away by the Irish authorities, partly out of anti-Semitism and partly because they wanted to favour Catholic citizens and not take away jobs from Irish people. And indeed this did become a problem for the Irish politically following the Second World War, especially when it comes to the United Nations, because the UN in many ways was actually just the old boys club of the Allies during the Second World War. And because Ireland was not one of the Allies, they had remained staunchly neutral the entire time, they were not allowed into the United Nations. And their entrance was actually vetoed from 1946 when it was created by the Soviet Union, and it was only allowed to join in 1955. Although 6 years later, in 1961, the Irish certainly showed the world that despite not having actively engaged in the Second World War at the siege of Jadotville in the Congo, they were more than capable of holding their own when they held off a much larger force of mercenaries, which has recently been immortalized in what I will call an absolutely epic film that I recommend you watch. But anyway, that is after the Second World War, and that is also the end of my video on Ireland during the Second World War. Let me know in the comments below, have you been enjoying this series? Have you followed along with the others, the video about Iceland, and there may or may not have been a few other ones out at this point as well. Do let me know if you find this kind of content interesting and which other countries that are not as much discussed during the Second World War you would like me to take a look at next. If you're from Ireland, how did I do with the Irish pronunciation? I don't think there were that many actually in this video, and so hopefully didn't make too much of a pig's ear of it, but I always find it very interesting to look at this kind of period of history and to look at some things going on in Ireland as well. So thank you all so much for watching. I have been Hilbert, Good Marget, and I will see you all next time.